From the European Parliament in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thank you for joining us tonight, and this is what we have on the program for you. Losing patience. Europe reacts to a new Brexit twist that may remove the option of a third UK vote. Yellow vest ban. France sacks a police chief and vows to shut down violent protests. Facebook fallout. Calls for a crackdown over extremist content after a New Zealand terror attack is live-streamed. AI race. Why Europe wants to lead the world in so-called ethical artificial intelligence. And facing the music. A famed Italian opera house returns millions of euros to Saudi Arabia. It is time to meet our panelists this evening. Of course, we have Darren McCaffrey, our political editor at Euronews. So, Darren, what are you watching today?
Well, I think, as you say, in the wake of what happened in Christchurch, given we've got elections, not least of all here in Europe, in the coming months, social media, Facebook in particular, under an awful lot of pressure. How they respond is crucial, though. They keep saying they're proactive in trying to tackle all these issues. If not, it's clear, I think, regulators both in the United States and in Brussels and elsewhere will clamp down on them.
And big question mark on what exactly to do and how far to go. All right, also joining us tonight, Marian Harkin. She's an Irish MEP with the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats here at the European Parliament. What about you, Marian? What are you watching?
Well, of course, Brexit. I was saying I was in the States for 4 days. I just arrived back early this morning, flying all night from Boston. So I feel as if I'm a little out of sync with what's happening here. But a few minutes on Raw Politics.
You're going to catch on, Marian. You will. All right, and also joining us, Daniel Hannan. He is a British MEP with the European Conservatives and Reformists group. What about you, Dan?
Well, I've been very interested in the way in which governments have been reacting to the abominations in Christchurch. A terrorist against a state is very weak. They're like a mouse against an elephant. Their only hope is to goad the beast into behaving in a way that wounds itself. And I'm afraid the reason that terrorism sometimes works is because governments do sometimes overreact.
All right. Well, we will go to Christchurch later on. But first, we begin with Brexit tonight, because you might never have heard of UK Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow. But yesterday, he put himself in the eye of the Brexit hurricane by announcing that he was ruling out a third vote on Theresa May's Brexit deal. Well, the UK PM must now come here to Brussels on Thursday to ask for a Brexit extension and hopes that she finds EU leaders in a forgiving mood. But this morning, EU affairs ministers all sounded a little impatient. Let's take a listen.
The clock is ticking and time is running out, and we are really exhausted by these negotiations, and I expect clear and precise proposals of the British government why such an extension is necessary. It's not just a game, it's an extremely serious situation.
Our clear preference is not to have no deal. We would certainly prefer having any agreement, but we think it's not really our choice at this stage.
Well, even German Chancellor Angela Merkel sounded a little confused about Brexit this morning, confessing that she wasn't aware of 17th century British parliamentary bylaws. But she knows, as everyone else does, that time is running out. Take a listen.
Ich werde bis zur letzten Stunde der Laufdauer des 29. März dafür kämpfen, dass wir noch zu einem geordneten Austritt kommen. Und da haben wir nicht viel Zeit, aber immer noch einige Tage Zeit. Und ich sehe mich jetzt zu dieser Stunde außerstande, irgendwie zu mutmaßen, wofür ich am Donnerstag sein werde, weil das unglaublich davon abhängt, was wird Theresa May vorbringen, wie sieht die Situation aus, was passiert noch im Parlament. Darauf werden wir adäquat und auch gemeinsam als 27 reagieren. Und je weniger jeder sozusagen seine Vermutungen äußert, umso einfacher ist das.
Okay, let's first go to our correspondent, Vincent McAviney in London. Vincent, I mean, yesterday we had Speaker of the House, John Bercow, ruling out a third vote, but it seems that Theresa May, she hasn't given up yet, has she?
Good evening, Tessa. That's right, she hasn't given up. There are just 10 days to go until the UK leaves the European Union, deal or no deal. But it isn't the way the Prime Minister thought these days were playing out this week after John Bercow threw that spanner in the works yesterday. So at the moment, she is writing a letter to Donald Tusk asking for an extension until the 30th of June, but possibly with more time. And apparently, Cabinet got pretty heated this morning because the Prime Minister wouldn't actually say how much time she thought was needed. She just needed the room for manoeuvre. And Andrea Leadsom, who is a strong leaver in the government, said it was now a Cabinet of Remainers and criticised going beyond that date of the 30th of June. Now, what the Prime Minister is also contending with, and her backroom staff are poring over, obscure parliamentary process. As Angela Merkel was saying there, she's not aware of the rules from the 17th century, and I think those working inside Downing Street as well are poring over them to try to figure out what would be the substantial changes needed to have that third meaningful vote. Here's what the Brexit Secretary Stephen Barclay had to say about that.
So there are a number of rulings that we need to look at, but it is the case that the Speaker's ruling yesterday raises the bar, and we need to see what is different as we approach the next vote. And clearly, if members of Parliament themselves are changing their vote, that does suggest that circumstances have changed.
Now, there's lots of talks from experts about putting things down like a paving motion or even proroguing parliaments, which means ending this parliamentary term, starting a new one, possibly even having to have a Queen's speech and then bringing the vote back then. That is all the procedural side of this, though. For Theresa May, she also has to focus on saying to the EU that she has enough of a plan once she gets past all of that, that this extension needs to be approved. And that is not clear at the moment because she also needs to get on board all of those MPs that she's been working on from her own party, the ERG group, the DUP and even some Labour MPs to get her deal over the line, because it's unclear at the moment whether or not she can do that. And there are reports today that around 20 of that ERG group who have still voted against Theresa May's withdrawal agreement at the last chance and are saying they'll vote against it this time round, are talking about actually wanting possibly that delay because they would go on strike. They wouldn't vote through any government legislation in an attempt to try and bring down Theresa May, replace her with one of their own number or someone sympathetic to them and try to have a different kind of Brexit. So it's an incredibly confusing picture here for Theresa May, and it's little wonder that leaders around Europe are watching on, unsure of what's going to happen, because Theresa May, frankly, is pretty unsure herself as she heads to that EU Council meeting later in the week.
Thank you for that, Vincent McAvaney there in London. Yes, confusing indeed. And Dan, we were talking before we went to air, and you were saying if it were up to you, you just want to leave. But now Theresa May, it looks like she's going to ask for an extension. But the question, as Vincent was saying, is how long? What is your reading on this? What do you think she's trying to do?
The basic problem is that when MPs decided to put this question to the people, it never occurred to them that they might get an answer that they didn't like. And so for 2.5 years, we've had this Westminster crisis of MPs trying to wriggle out of the promises that they made about implementing the referendum result. I mean, I know it's easy to slide into saying Britain is in crisis. Britain as a whole isn't in crisis. You know, we've best unemployment figures we've ever had. The stock exchange is booming. Exports are up. You know, consumer confidence is up. But there is a Westminster crisis caused by this absolute refusal to do what MPs
the pound isn't doing
do.
very well, is it? Anyway.
Well, in general, though, I mean, given the predictions that we were given during the campaign and given how it's actually worked out, I think it's pretty difficult to argue.
It is the best performing currency against the dollar this year, apparently. So there is some belief in the system. I think in part, though, you know, you're right. Westminster and politicians certainly did not expect the results. However, it wasn't terribly clear that even though Britain voted to leave the EU, in what fashion it would do so, under what circumstances. And that was a democratic mandate, but that the Parliament's deciding how Britain should leave on what terms, was elected, yes, on a manifesto, both for Labour and the Tories, that they would leave the European Union, but they were elected in 2017. They've got a far more recent mandate than even the referendum.
Yes, but they were elected on the basis of a very clear, in both cases, Labour and Conservative, very clear manifesto promises to uphold the referendum. And they are now trying to wriggle out of that promise, which is the basic problem.
Well, yeah, of course, but representative democracy, you know, politicians do wriggle out of manifestos all the time. I think people voting for people like Ken Clarke were in no doubt that he was a Brexiteer.
He was the only one. He was literally the only one who didn't vote to do it.
Yes, but there are many different versions of Brexit. Jeremy Corbyn has his Brexit. Theresa May has hers. We have the Malthouse Compromise. No matter where you go, there's somebody with their particular version.
But that's the problem, isn't it?
It seems to me that is the problem, that there cannot be agreement on a Brexit that the majority of people can back. And I mean, one of the questions I wonder about when I look at the House of Commons is, does anybody talk to anybody else? John Berco's statement came as a bombshell. Theresa May did not know that her own Attorney General was going to give that advice.
I do wonder,
but I mean, I just find this incredible, what's happening. And whether it takes some kind of cross-party initiative or whatever, it needs to come, because politics has to get back to the business.
Well, one thing that is clear is that this deal with the backstop is not going to go through. I mean, now John Bercow has said, you can't run the same question again. So either there is a substantive change, which the EU says...
Why are you not sure? Why?
I thought perhaps over the weekend that there might be 20, 25 Conservatives would vote against, but she may get that number of Labour to support. She may not. I'm only saying...
I really don't think. But in any event, it's now been ruled that they can't put the same question again.
Specifically, absolutely. But I believe there are many ways.
I mean, I think there are. I think that there were compromises available in the immediate aftermath of the vote that would have reflected the narrowness of the result and would have minimised the friction of Brexit. I argued before, during and after the campaign for a kind of EFTA-type deal that would preserve large parts of the single market, but would opt us out of the political institutions. The trouble is that this deal does exactly the worst of all worlds. It keeps us in the customs union, but outside the single market, which no one would have. I do want to ask about
the European election, because this is what the rest of Europe, they're very interested in looking at, because they don't, I mean, it's very unclear how it's going to pan out. So how would, as a Leaver, you want to get out of this, but does it make sense for you to run again and get people to vote again in this, if you want to leave anyway? It just doesn't make sense.
Of course, I'd much rather not have the election.
But
I'd much rather not have it on political grounds and on personal grounds, because I've arranged my whole life around the basis of going on to do other things. So, of course, we should honour the result of the referendum and not hold the elections if that can be done. But if other MPs either overturn or prolong the Brexit issue, then that's going to be on them rather than on me. And the idea that Brexiteers will be blamed rather than the people actually doing the delaying is crazy.
So Brexiteers will run again, in this sense?
You know, it's a personal as well as just a political judgment that I think that not standing if there is an election would look like desertion under fire, and worse than that would be desertion under fire. So I may have to, although I have to say it's a thundering pain, because there are lots of other things I'd rather be doing.
I just think the way you describe it, desertion under fire, is not a good way. There's nobody challenging you in that way. But I do understand what you say, because you'd wonder what contribution you could make here. Why would you be elected? So I think perhaps some mechanism will be found if Theresa May can show any kind of clear plan and pathway, that maybe some mechanism will be found.
I think the concern here, or why some Brexiteers may well support a long extension, potentially 2 years, is you reset the clock, and that ultimately the Conservative Party gets rid of Theresa May. This is in an ideal Brexiteer world. They get someone who is much more sympathetic to
just much more competent. It's about competence rather than about ideology.
But then uses that leverage as a continuing full member of the European Union, with the ability to be enormously disruptive if they so want, and that they can secure
Do you agree with that?
No, I mean, I don't think there'd be any plan to come here and be obstreperous and difficult. But what I do think is a fair point is, as far as I can tell, a lot of the people pushing this long delay really do see it as that. They don't see it as a way of cancelling Brexit. One of the conditions being mooted is that Britain wouldn't veto or involve itself in the next budget round that begins at the end of 2020, because we wouldn't be there. So I think, frankly, if we can get a good Brexit next year rather than a bad one this year, that's
there is concern about that in Brussels, though, if they give an extension.
Have a crash out and no deal.
All right. I suppose some people would disagree, but yes, let's give Marion the last word on that. All right, let's move on to another story that we are watching, because he promised a strong response. And last night, French President Emmanuel Macron, he took action. Yellow Vest protests will be banned on the Champs-Élysées and in parts of Bordeaux and Toulouse if authorities believe extremists are present. It's a response to the scale of the violence and riots seen on the streets of Paris last weekend, but it's not a complete ban on the Gilets jaunes, who won't be stopped from peaceful protests. Now, let's take a listen to the French president last night.
Et pour être concret, nous nous donnons donc les moyens d'interdire des périmètres. Et donc, oui, les samedis prochains, les Champs-Élysées, comme d'ailleurs différents quartiers de centre-ville qui ont été beaucoup frappés par cette crise, seront interdits à toute forme de rassemblement.
Right, that was the French president. Now joining us in the studio to discuss this is Fabrice Potier. He's senior advisor with the Atlantic Commission on Election Integrity, as well as Rasmussen Global. So, all right, let's look at what Emmanuel Macron is doing here. Is this the right response? We saw the video. I mean, I suppose most people would be appalled and shocked by that. Is this the right response?
Yes, of course. We are dealing here with the most radical elements of the Gilets jaunes. So this is about pure violence. And I think the role of the president and his government is to apply the rule of law. So I think French people are following that, they're supporting their president. And I was walking on the Champs-Élysées yesterday, and it's a very disturbing landscape.
And you don't think this is walking along the lines of being undemocratic already? You think that that is justified?
No, I think it's justified because these people are not asking for anything apart from breaking and actually stealing things from shops and restaurants. So there is no political grievances here. And if there are political grievances, they should do so without violence.
And Marianne, when you look at what's happening with the Gilets jaunes movement, what are your thoughts now when you see that?
It's always thin ice. Yes, I agree. People have to march within the rule of law. But when you ban marches from certain places or at certain times, at one level, it can give some oxygen, that can be used as an argument to say our government is not listening, they're not hearing us, we need to up the ante. So it is thin ice, and how it's managed, I think, will be very important.
I think there's no doubt that, this movement's been hijacked by those particularly on the far right and the far left, and that it is not the movement it started back in November.
No.
There were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets back in November. It's down now to tens of thousands. Support was at, nearly 70% in the polls. It's now down to 40%. And in part, that comes actually to a rather successful strategy by Emmanuel Macron, who has gone around. I think he was in Paris listening to to scientists and academics the other night, spent 8 hours on the platform as his listening tour continues. And to a degree, it has kind of worked. His poll ratings are certainly up. But when you've got violence like we saw on Saturday,
Sure.
I mean, that is not acceptable in any democracy.
Sure.
And the first preserve of government is to preserve the rule of law.
I think my question would be, if I were watching that, and maybe some in the Gilets jaunes would be saying, OK, if it did not happen on Champs-Élysées, if it happened on a street that was less fancy, do you think this response would have happened,
Yes, I think so, because when you see the damage done to actually small shops, like newspaper
because we can see all the messages scrolled up. It's the bourgeoisie against the rich, against the elite.
Yes, but I think these are just, messages. The real message is the violence here. And I think I agree that the president is right to basically enforce the rule of law. I do agree that there were originally some real grievances, and I think the president has bought time until now. Now the time is going to be for decision, not for just discussion and dialogue.
Where do we go from here with the Gilets jaunes?
Well, I think he's promised to wrap up the Grand Débat and come up with some proposals to meet some of the legitimate grievances. So I think now the expectation is no longer to have forum and discussion and dialogue, but to have real decision that can meet some of the expectations. And this is what the president is focusing on.
That should take some of the steam out of the protests. The people who genuinely went on the streets to protest because they felt that was all they could do. And as you say, the numbers are significantly down.
I don't think the French work on the basis that it's the last resort. I think it's not all they could do. It's kind of primarily what they wanted to.
There were very large numbers, huge support for it, so it didn't come from nowhere. And you have to listen to what people say. But it has been taken over. But it's still thin ice, so how the president responds and how they manage the security. As you said, it's not a complete ban, and it perhaps will be down to whoever it's in charge.
And do you think this is a general shift in the way French presidents handle massive protests like this? Because in the past, they tend to backtrack and give in to protest.
But, I mean,
now...
Fabrice is in the sense of, like, you know, just because he's listening, we have had some action, but clearly not enough. It is, you're right, in terms of what happens
he held his
next.
ground, actually.
Well, I mean, to a degree.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there were tax cuts and other things. So what he does next, and also I think how the European Union elections battle out over the coming months, given he's invested in them enormously, will be very important as well.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No,
last word.
I think he's working a tight balance between meeting some of the grievances, but don't forget there's also a silent majority in France.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily want the president to stop
he's built his reputation on not necessarily giving in to every single protest.
Well, there you go. All right. Well, from France, let's move over to Italy and the story of a vexed deal between a leading opera house and Saudi Arabia. Let's take a look. Benvenuto alla Scala. It's the home of opera in the Italian city of Milan, drawing in the finest musicians from around the world. But that's not all it's been attracting. The 18th century opera house has hit the headlines as it returns more than 3 million euros in funding to Saudi Arabia after a 5-year partnership deal with the kingdom sparked criticism, including from Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini. With Saudi Arabia's human rights record in the spotlight, could the house lights be coming down on Saudi investments in Europe? Was that a good decision? What is that?
Listen, it's a difficult one. The Italian government has clearly some economic public debt issues. There is a lot of Saudi money, not just in Italy, but across Europe. I think it just hit a symbolic nerve here because La Scala is a very strong symbol of Italy and Italy's independence. But I think we are giving here a bit of a hard time to the Italians, given that I think if you start looking at where is the Saudi money invested,
I think you're right. You're right. It's not the only place where Saudi money is.
Who owns half of the property in London? You know, it is
Paris.
And Paris and other European capitals. It's very, very difficult.
Possibly Dublin.
And there you go. All right, coming up on Raw Politics, from dating apps to self-driving cars to your smartphone. As AI infiltrates our lives, we look at EU plans to develop ethical artificial intelligence. Plus, Facebook backlash. We talked to a top executive at the tech giant about new calls for regulation after the live streaming of a terror attack. That's next. Welcome back to the show and to Brussels, where this week European officials are looking to the future. Well, they've been discussing how Europe can catch up with the US and China in the great artificial intelligence race. But they've also been grappling with the ethics of placing more and more of our lives in the hands of technology. Artificial intelligence. Hear the phrase and you probably think of this. But AI is no longer confined to science fiction books. It's in our everyday lives, from internet searches that learn from you and then make targeted suggestions to home-assisted devices like Alexa, which talk to their users and predict their needs. And there's probably no better example than self-driving cars. No highway code in sight here. AI technology allows them to navigate traffic while carefree passengers catch up on their emails. Artificial intelligence is rapidly changing the world around us, and that's just the beginning. And as Europe tries to get in on the action, a question you'll hear asked more and more: how much trust should we place in smart technology? Well, back with me in the studio is Fabrice Potier from the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. And also joining us for this panel is Madi Delvaux, a Luxembourgish MEP who sits with the Alliance of Socialists and Democrats here at the Parliament. And also joining us, Fanny Hidvegi from Access Now, an organization working on human rights in the digital age. And she's also a member of the high-level expert group on AI for the European Commission. All right, let's start with the concept of AI. First of all, is there consensus here that AI is the future? Is this where we are going?
I suppose that, well, AI is already in our daily life, and it will increasingly be in our jobs, in our private life, in communication. And but I just come from a discussion on ethics in artificial intelligence. But the problem is that nobody can define artificial intelligence.
Why is that? So nobody can define what it is.
Because it's a big variety of products, of application, of devices. So it's commonly, I would say, it's making things more clever.
More intelligent in that it anticipates what human beings need, perhaps. Is that how we can define it?
I think the point is that there's no agreed upon technical definition, but we have a very good understanding of what AI covers. It's more a range of things and technology than one specific aspect. And the video captured it quite well. The main point is that the system is learning and adapting and changing.
I mean, that can only be positive. I was just looking at some positives of what it can do. So it can make cancer treatment less toxic. Machines can take over dangerous jobs, or it can anticipate our needs and reduce energy consumption. Obviously, there are the downsides as well. Facial recognition. I think you have been campaigning for more regulation on it. But why?
I try to campaign for ethical principles and for regulation, because I think if we want really to decide how we want to interact with artificial intelligence, there are some principles that we have to respect, and we have to protect also citizens and not look only at the opportunities. Of course, they are great opportunities, but also prevent or try to minimize the risk for the humans about liability, about safety, about privacy.
But if I may, I think here the real question is what kind of European model we want to create. Do we want Europe to be a global AI power, or do we want Europe to end up being a global AI follower? And what kind of regulation can square the circle between our privacy, which is obviously very important, but also our competitiveness at the global level? Because what we are facing are two giants, China and the US. We don't want either of their models, but we need to come up with something that doesn't strangle competitiveness and innovation.
Yes,
I'm just worried, if I may, I'm just worried that the EU is putting the carts before the horses, the regulation before the real AI industry has emerged from Europe. So I think we need
because
to
Europe is way
trade
behind
this.
in terms of the actual technology.
It is de facto behind because of basically we don't have the scale.
But the point is, I think, that the EU must be the thought leader on artificial intelligence, but it matters how. And Access Now has been advocating very strongly that the EU is in a very good place, both on to have the responsibility as well, not just
so you're talking about
option.
Ethical artificial intelligence?
No, not at all. That's missing the point. Ethics has a role, but only after the enforcement of human rights and other legal standards. It's good to talk about ethics, but the basics has to be to look at what existing legislations and human rights frameworks we already have in place. And after that, once we've done that, ethics comes on top.
Okay, so why is the EU talking about ethical artificial intelligence, and why is this the route that they want to take? Okay,
I think the concern is that it gets out of control, because AI, by essence, is self-learning machines or agents who will not only do things, but decide on what things to do for us. And there's, the Frankenstein phenomenon.
So isn't that why regulation is needed?
Yes, also because it relies very much on crunching our private data. And the more data you give to these agents, the more they're able to see patterns.
And I just wanted to add that GDPR was considered as an obstacle to innovation, and now the world is looking at the European Union.
This is the EU law on data protection and privacy,
protection, and even big American industrials say, well, we need a regulation like the European protection.
Yes, but I think the real thing is that the one who will write the global regulation on AI will be the one who will have the biggest industry. And for the moment, China is writing the rules de facto. So I think the EU needs to wake up on the need to have a real capacity,
so that's
not
why
just rules.
I am campaigning, for instance, for international standards, and I think the European Union should speak with one voice and defend our interests, our industry, because we are still good at certain points.
Just one point is that there are already international standards in place, at least from the human rights framework, and that's why we say that ethics can only come as a complementary part. And it's interesting to look at all the EU national member state level strategies. We compare them to each other. And there's not a lot of conversations about the societal impact that we're talking about. There's a lot of talks about investment on the other hand.
I mean, it's nice to talk about this, but this is something you brought up. In fact, it's like killer robots. It's already out there. I think you said it was too late already to rein this back in. So if technology is moving that...
I didn't say anything about killer robots.
So if it is moving that fast, I mean, if killer robots, as they call it, weapons, are moving that fast, so is it too late?
But anyway,
for example,
weapons are there to
weapons,
kill. We didn't in our report, we didn't touch on weapons because it's about security.
And weapons is the tip of the iceberg.
Because
it's a lifestyle.
Our look is went to civil use. What is our interactions in normal
Instead of
citizens.
killer robots, we should talk about the technologies when it decides on how you get a loan or how predictive policing is already in
and
place.
China has that in place.
Not just China. There are European countries that are looking into pilot projects and piloting also facial recognition, CCTV cameras, which have very serious discrimination
Wouldn't that
aspects.
make life easier on the other side of the argument? Wouldn't that help us?
Yes,
make
but I
decisions
think us Europeans care a great deal about our privacy and our sense of our data about ourselves. We should be the first to make decisions about what we want and how we want. So I think it's about transparency rather than interdicting technology.
And this is also about non-discrimination, because if the algorithm or the model makes a decision and you are discriminated because of the city where you live or your gender or your race, and this is a discrimination. Well, there is also discrimination with humans, but at least you need to check and to protest. There is a need to have, as you say, transparency, and the people who program all these algorithms, they have to be accountable.
So let's leave artificial intelligence there for the moment, and let's turn our attention to Crimea, where chants of Russia were in the air last night as Vladimir Putin held a rally to mark the 5th anniversary of his country's annexation of the region from Ukraine. Let's take a look.
Россия распахнула объятия, свое сердце и душу, и с радостью и восторгом приняла вас в свою огромную многонациональную семью. Добьемся всех поставленных перед собой целей, решим все задачи, потому что есть главное условие. Оно заключается в том, что мы вместе, да? Россия! Россия!
But clearly the scene is very different from inside and outside Russia. You were shaking your head as you were watching that.
Yes. Yes, I do not understand how someone can say we are solving all the problems together because we are
invading a country.
Well, and it works.
And quite a contrast, and indeed, when you see those images, quite a contrast from the take from outside of Russia and inside.
Emotions also.
But if I may, I think Putin is on the slightly desperate side of things. I mean, his ratings at home are doing, much worse than before. He's had a couple of PR disasters
so he kind of
in his way.
needed something like that,
He's reviving this kind of nationalistic, pan-Russian flame. But I think it also shows that he's worried about his hold.
Well, there you go. All right, coming up on Raw Politics, a deadly attack streamed live on Facebook, and now growing calls for that tech giant to crack down on extremist content. We talked to Facebook about the backlash after the break. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, Facebook is facing increasing pressure from governments on how they deal with violent content. The tech giant has received widespread condemnation after an attack in New Zealand on Friday, which was live-streamed for 17 minutes. Australia's Prime Minister is calling for a crackdown and for the issue to be added to the G20 agenda. And New Zealand's Prime Minister wants more action to remove videos of the shooting, and here is what she had to say.
Contact with Facebook. They have given us updates on their efforts to have it removed, but as I say, it's our view that it should not be distributed, available, able to be viewed. It is horrendous. And while they've given us those assurances, ultimately the responsibility does sit with them.
All right, back with us to talk about this is Marianne Harkin, MEP, and Fabrice Poitier, and also our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Okay, let's talk about this. How do you police content like this? I mean, this is clearly a very sensitive topic. How do you police something, extremist content like that? There's also a call from the former CEO of Facebook in Australia to say, oh, ban live streaming altogether. Where do you draw the line?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is recognise what the problem is. And I think the New Zealand Prime Minister put it very well when she said that Facebook is the publisher and not just the postman. It's the medium is the message. So therefore, their absolute and utter responsibility is to recognise that and put in place whatever algorithms or measures are necessary.
I think that is very interesting. Is the messenger to be blamed? And you did manage to speak, Darren, to Facebook today.
Yeah, indeed, and there is this perennial battle between what is Facebook. Is it simply a platform or is it a publisher? And if it is a publisher, what responsibility does it have? And as you say, there was a Facebook executive in Brussels today to talk actually to commissioners about the challenges that Facebook face here in terms of the European elections. But clearly, we asked her about Christchurch and the aftermath of that and what Facebook's responsibility was. And this is what that Facebook executive had to say when I spoke to her a little bit earlier today. Given what's happened in recent days, I mean, clearly seeing the mass shooting of dozens of people in a mosque is not what would be described as an authentic and meaningful to people on their news feeds. How do you stop that from happening?
So first of all, our hearts go out to the victims and those affected by these terrorist attacks. We've been working closely with leaders in New Zealand, and we've been removing any content that violates our policy. So to give you one example, in the first 24 hours, we removed 1.5 million videos related to the attacks. 1.2 million of those we removed automatically at the point of upload, using different technologies that we have to find duplicates of videos and audio. And we're going to continue working closely with local authorities.
But isn't the point, though, it's not about removing them, it's about ensuring they're not broadcast in the first place.
And that's why it's critical.
If we broadcast that, okay, and we're broadcasters rather than, you know, simply platforms, and there is a blurred line in that. But if we did that, we would be immediately taken off air. The whole point is, you talk about kind of taking down these videos, but they should never be there in the first place, surely.
And that's why it's critical that 1.2 million of those videos were removed automatically at the point of upload. And we're going to continue working around the clock with local authorities to make sure that we're removing any content that is related to these incidents or glorifies these incidents in any way. That's a commitment that we take very seriously and one where we're going to continue to stay really focused.
But if you're going to be really proactive, wouldn't you say, actually, let's stop live streaming until we can ensure that this type of live stream could never happen again? Because that would be preventative rather than reactive.
You know, as I said, we're going to stay working on this issue and understand what more we can do to make sure that we keep people safe and that we ensure that the experience that they have on Facebook are within our policies.
Just finally, but isn't the inevitable path, given the outcry we've heard from the Australian Prime Minister today, we're hearing from European leaders, even from President Trump, that ultimately what we will find, if Facebook is not proactive, that these rules will simply be imposed upon them, and actually what you wanted and resisted you'll have to give way on.
Well, again, we haven't resisted regulation. We're being part of conversations to talk about how regulation can be effective in fighting the problems that we all face. And I think one example that's important to call out is we're not actually waiting for regulation. So take ads transparency, for example. There is no regulation right now governing social media when it relates to ads transparency, but that didn't stop us from being proactive and setting what we believe is a new bar for our industry in being transparent about political and issue ads. We're going to continue to work with local authorities to understand how we can more effectively fight these problems. We think regulation over time will be a piece of that, but we're not going to wait because there's urgency now.
So has Facebook's role irrevocably changed? Like, are they now publishers and should be subject, as you brought up in that interview, subject to the same laws that the media would be subject to?
I think the pendulum is swinging towards that reality that Facebook will have to be, you know, register in the law, either the EU law or national laws, as a publisher, therefore have a legal responsibility on what is happening on its platform. But the reality is this one. Facebook has a bigger community than India and Chinese population together, and a smaller police force than the equivalent of the Belgian police force. So I think they've built something that is kind of out of control from their point of view, and they will have to take back control by actually giving the users more transparency and more accountability. So, and again, I think the next European Parliament is going to legislate on giving Facebook, you know, a clearer status and more responsibility.
So is banning...
Well, to defend Facebook a little bit here, I mean, ultimately, you know, they aren't actually creating the content themselves, and in that essence, they would argue they are a platform. And while they are a platform that for the vast majority, must be said, the vast majority of people, utilise Facebook in a good way, and it's an amazing way to stay in touch with people all over the world, and people do have a genuinely good experience from it. Clearly, in small cases, they don't. I mean, how much responsibility can Facebook be held responsible for people's individual actions and their thoughts? It's quite difficult.
A bank gets dirty money. Who is responsible? I think it's both the depositor, but also the bank.
Yes, and you have to accept that the medium is now the message. It's as simple as that. And, information is the new currency. And they have monetized information. And they now have to find ways and means of making she said, the 1.2 million out of the 1.5 that they stopped as they were being uploaded, that has to be 1.5 million.
Are we saying that we can never go back to that time when a platform can exist and it's free for all and we call that democratic? We can never go back to that time.
What we can't go back to is where there is no regulation. That's what we can't go back to. The type of regulation we look at has to be carefully thought out. I mean, obviously, who will guard the guardians? We have to be careful of that as well, that doesn't become an instrument for some other body or entity to use.
Who decides what's good and bad?
Yeah.
And to come back at the bank point, for example, if I hand someone a megaphone, am I then responsible for what they utter through that megaphone? I'm not entirely sure that I should be, because, what you can't blame social media for is somehow that they've invented this hatred, or they've invented people doing...
But they're helping to propagate it, Darren.
Well, I mean...
They are absolutely helping to propagate it. The reason
I think there's a difference. I think there's a difference between helping to propagate it and it allowing to happen. Those are two distinct things. I think it's wrong to say Facebook are helping, let's say, this terrible incident in New Zealand to be broadcast. It's allowing it to happen. Helping is a different thing.
But the reason it was broadcast was to gain notoriety, and that's the issue here. I mean, this. Oh, it's so shocking what happened. You can't even begin to think about it. But that wasn't the objective. The real objective was to upload that and allow as many people as possible to see it. It wasn't just about the horrible act itself.
If it weren't on Facebook, it would have appeared somewhere else. So how do you address that? I mean, yes, you can regulate all these big giants, and then it just keeps coming up, and you do not solve the problem.
That's why it's not just about Facebook. I think it's about regulation across the board. And I do agree that it should not be, putting a new straitjacket on, basically, that we constrain also our freedom of expression. But I think there has to be a little bit more responsibility from the platform owners in order to also clean their act and anticipate this kind of situation and be either quicker at restricting materials that are actually very radical and disturbing, and owning up more to this situation, because to say, we are not responsible.
Last point
just
there.
Very briefly, what is interesting is Facebook is now starting potentially to move away from this open-ended platform to closed platforms,
as you say, pendulum.
like WhatsApp, for example. And in some ways, that's much more dangerous because it's peer-to-peer, no one knows what's been said, and has been proven in India, actually can be also equally dangerous.
As we have seen, it resulted in some deaths in India. All right, we'll have to leave it at that. We are coming up after the break on Raw Politics. The UK is deadlocked. The EU is frustrated. So maybe it's time to get creative. Coming up on Your Call tonight, we want to hear your solutions for Brexit. How would you solve the stalemate? Is the answer another referendum or new negotiating teams? Here's how you can get in touch. You can look at your screen. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, we have been hearing from politicians and journalists on today's top stories, but we want to hear from you. Now, your call is coming up at 7 p.m. CET, and here is what we'll be talking about.
Order! Order!
Now that the third vote on Theresa May's Brexit deal appears to be dead, a request for a long Brexit extension is looking more likely. But the EU27 are insisting they need a reason to grant it. London and Brussels are at an impasse on what to do. And we want to know, how would you solve the Brexit deadlock? Emmanuel Macron's strong response. Rioting and looting over the weekend as black-clad anarchists joined Yellow Vest demonstrations. The French president says he will shut down protests in the hardest-hit areas if violent groups take part. But does that set a dangerous precedent? Is banning Yellow Vest protests undemocratic? Artificial intelligence may sound like science fiction, but it's not. It's already here. And Europe is trying to figure out how to deal with the technology. Computers that can learn, reason, and make decisions. Critics warn about the danger of giving machines too much control. But are artificial intelligence fears overblown? We want to know what you think. How would you solve the Brexit deadlock? Is banning yellow vest protests undemocratic? Are artificial intelligence fears overblown? Well, those are the questions, and here's how you can get in touch with us. The contact information is on your screen. You can call us for free at 00800-3333-7002 or send an email at rawpoll@euronews.com, or look for us on social media and use the hashtag #RawPolitics, and you can find us on Skype. All right, so back with us to talk about this is Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, Marian Harkin, and also joining us, Andrew Byrne from the Sunday Times. And Andrew and Marian will be with us tonight on your call. Yeah, so when we're talking about, I think Brexit is a big story here. I know you're all looking at me. I want to know what you would do to solve this Brexit deadlock. Start with you, Darren.
You just want to get me sacked, or indeed, I don't know, this is way above my pay grade about what to do. I mean, I think we are looking at, well, we're certainly looking at a technical extension, potentially a longer one. In fact, actually, Emmanuel Macron, an aide to Emmanuel Macron, has said this afternoon that an extension is not for certain or automatic, piling the pressure on Theresa May. Many would say that they potentially need to reset this process.
All right.
Begin from start.
I'm sure there are lots of options. What about you, Andrew? What are you looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I had a solution made up for how to fix Brexit, but I left it off stage, so I can't remember. It'll come back to me.
Sure.
No, I mean, I guess the fundamental question, people are frustrated. It's been over 2 years. At the same time, something as substantial as Brexit, do you want to get it done quickly, or do you want to get it done right? And I guess that's probably the reason why most MPs are so adamant that they don't want a no deal at any cost. They want some kind of managed, orderly exit.
Marian, surely you have a solution. I know, definitely.
You're allowed to have a solution.
Okay. Right. How do you get to a managed, orderly exit? I think perhaps at the very beginning, Theresa May worked with too few people. She didn't bring her cabinet with her. She didn't reach out. And I think that sowed the seeds of where we are now. I'm not sure if she can go back to the beginning of that again, but it is something that is absolutely crucial. And I think maybe that's what we need to look at. That doesn't necessarily have to take a great deal of time, but until she comes forward with a proposition that can guarantee support in the House of Commons.
Many would say the solution to this, or the problem for this, is Theresa May herself, and that she needs to go.
You'll have to bring your solution tonight, though.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Yeah.
All right. Well, join in the conversation. So join us tonight and bring in your solution. We'd love to know what you think. How would you solve the Brexit deadlock? Give us your ideas. Now, all of the contact information is on your screen. You can call us for free at 00800-3333-7002. Send us an email at rawpoll@euronews.com. And on social media, use the hashtag #RawPolitics, and also look for us on Skype. All right, let's head back to London for tonight's Raw Moment and take a look at the Commons Speaker John Bercows' run-in with the great British press. Let's take a look.
Mr. Bercows, I really feel you ought to get yourself some coffee or tea. I did offer to buy you all coffee and tea, but you declined my kind offer. But you've obviously already drunk lots of coffee or tea, and I wish you well. It's a very, very impressive bobble hat you're wearing there, or perhaps not a bobble hat, but a hat of sorts. Anyway, I'm sure people are so very grateful to you for showing such an interest at this time of the morning.
It's a very interesting story, Mr.
Bercows.
Very well done. What next for Brexit, Mr. Bercows?
Perhaps, gentlemen, you'd allow me to work. Thank you, and I wish you a good day. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir.
I think as someone who has done that many times, i.e. being the reporter doorstepping politicians, clearly the number one rule is to try and avoid answering the question. The way that John Bercows did it just then, though, I'm not entirely sure you should conclude that he's a bit of a pompous tit, really.
What do you think of him, Andrew?
I mean, I'll keep my own personal views to myself, but it's strange seeing him out of context, and I think he's going to expect a lot more interest and scrutiny of his own life after he's taken such a public and prominent role in the Brexit process.
No, well, I mean, and that's the big thing. You know, he is also an elected politician who's potentially caused a constitutional crisis. You know, he should be held accountable.
Well, he knows how to deflect a question, I can tell you.
He does, and it's very strange to see him in that context.
Tea and
really
bubble
strange.
hats.
Exactly.
All right. Well, we would love to hear your views, so do join us after the show on Your Call and tell us what you're talking about. I'm also on Twitter @TessaCecilia, or you can look for @euronews and use the hashtag #RawPolitics. Have a good evening.